on the 0 Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow, and our good friend Mike Elk joins us now. He has been and is in Brazil covering the presidential election there. He's been filing those reports for his publication, the Payday Report. He is editor and publisher and reporter at the Payday Report. That's paydayreport.com. And he joins us now to fill us in on the Brazilian election. So first of all, Mike, welcome back to the program.
Great to be back on the show, Richard. We're here in Rio de Janeiro. I'm actually in the bedroom where I stayed when I attended journalism school here 15 years ago.
So full circle. So you're covering the election, presidential election there. I suspect that most of our listeners know that a far-right politician named Jair Bolsonaro is the president now. The former president, Lula, who spent time in jail on trumped-up charges, is running against him, right? And so give us an update. You filed a bunch of stories from there. First of all, let's just start with the overview. What are you seeing?
Well, while a lot of the U.S. media has ignored this election here in Brazil, which is the world's fourth largest democracy, Payday Report has been on the ground. We filed 14 dispatches. We have more coming out. We filed stories after stories here. And what we're seeing right now is that it's very, very close. Polls show that this is a 5 or 6 point race. And you have to take some of those polls with a grain of salt because Bolsonaro, who's fascist, he refers to himself as the Trump of the tropics. I believe Trump first called him that. And actually, many of the people who are advising Bolsonaro, like Steve Bannon, have worked closely with Trump. So there's a lot of parallels here. And what's happened is that, Bolsonaro has told his supporters not to cooperate with the polling firms. In fact, some of them were off. There's a lot of very complex reasons why they were off. Some of this has to do with the fact that a census wasn't taken in the last period. So some of the data's off, and a big chunk of it has to do with Bolsonaro not telling his supporters not to cooperate with the polling firms. So by all indications, this is a very close race, and everyone I know. In the first round of the election, Lula, who's a former trade union leader turned president, Lula is a historic figure in the history of Brazil. He first came to power as a trade union leader in the 1980s. He led a series of bold strikes that shut down the auto industry in São Paulo, which is the big auto capital of the country, and helped topple the dictatorship. Then he was elected president as the leader of the Workers' Party in 2002 and served till 2010. And then he was brought up on phony, trumped-up charges of corruption in the mid-2000s. He was in prison for nearly 2 years before the charges were dismissed. He was in prison so that he couldn't run in the last runoff in 2018. And it's important to bring up for readers that prior to him, there was a woman named Dilma who was in office, who was removed in a questionable impeachment by the Congress in Brazil that many consider to be a coup itself. So democracy is very fragile in Brazil. To put it in perspective, I'm 36 years old, and democracy is younger than I am in Brazil. Brazilian Constitution was ratified in 1988. The traditions here aren't as deep around democracy. There is some feeling among certain right-wing sectors that the 70s and the 80s were a good time in Brazil, that the auto industry came in, that the country started to boom, that there was some sort of order brought to the country. And, there's a feeling of going back to that period. And also to put it in perspective, the 34 years that Brazil has had democracy is the longest period in its history it's had a democratic rule. So the traditions aren't quite as deep as we necessarily have. Even things like going door to door aren't common here.
So you have a situation where, as abused, knocked around as their democracy has been by false charges and what might be described as a coup of a false impeachment. This is as much democracy as Brazil has enjoyed in a long time. I know in the first round of voting, where there are multiple candidates, the polling showed that Lula was expected to win an outright majority, and he didn't, right? So that's why this runoff between the two of them. And Bolsonaro's party did better than expected in the legislature. Is that right?
Yeah, well, what occurred was some polls showed him narrowly above the 50% margin, around 51, 52. And some showed him around 48. He winded up getting at about 48% of the vote. He beat Bolsonaro by about 6 million votes. And there were two other minor candidates, Ciro Gomez and Tebet, who combined got about 9 million, 10 million votes combined. So at this point, in order for Bolsonaro to win, he would have to pick up so many of those voters. And it's not necessarily clear he can do that. There's a lot of fear that if he does lose, that there will be widespread political violence. There's already been a big uptick in political violence. We've seen something like a 25% increase in political violence compared to this election period in 2020. We've seen just this weekend in Rio de Janeiro, a former congressman who's a close Bolsonaro ally named Roberto Jefferson was arrested because he was making calls for an armed uprising and showing all the guns he had stocked up on. Jefferson got in, when the police came to detain Jefferson, the federal police, he got into an armed shootout with the police and threw grenades at them, and wounded cops. So there's a very real threat. I just got back from south of Brazil in Paraná, where a Workers' Party official was assassinated at his birthday party. There have been other killings. A lot of people say that they won't wear red in public because of their fear of being attacked by Bolsonaro supporters.
Red, I assume, is the color of Lula's supporters?
Yeah, in the Workers' Party. So a lot of people are saying they won't wear red because of that. And so, you have a period where people were very scared, very intimidated, and it's not entirely clear what's going to happen next. The anxiety here is unlike anything I've seen. I think greater than the anxiety I think I saw when we defeated Trump in the U.S. In the days ahead of that. To put it in perspective, in Rio de Janeiro, you have something called militias. They're like paramilitary gangs. You have favelas here that are slums that were built off the grid in unzoned places, built somewhat illegally, while many of the constructors were giving bribes to the authorities to look the other way. And in these areas, beginning in the 80s and the 90s, you began getting these armed gangs of vigilantes, many of whom were off-duty cops, or many of them were former cops, would come in and take over these favelas. Then they would start running protection rackets. They would start selling cooking gas. They would start selling bootleg cable. They started buying apartment buildings and renting them out to people in these areas. And they started getting involved in all kind of land deals, that if you wanted to construct something, you had to give them a cut of the land deals. These are very powerful groups. They control areas of Rio de Janeiro. This is an area of about 8 million people. They control areas where something like 1.7 million people live. Now, if you look at, we have a story out on Payday Report. If you look at, a chart of where people voted in these favelas, right? Nationwide, polling shows that the poorest residents, those making below twice the federal minimum wage here, the poorest of the residents, the working class here, voted overwhelmingly for Lula. But in these areas that are controlled by these paramilitary gangs, they voted overwhelmingly for Bolsonaro. These paramilitary gangs promoted Bolsonaro. And also I've talked with some labor leaders that say that there was real fear of these paramilitary gangs. And violence is a major concern here in Rio. The murder rate in Brazil is 4 times the US. So the violence here that rages on because of the drug war, because of other things that happen here, is very, very real. So with the big shootout this week, with You're seeing calls for armed uprisings on social media. There's a lot of fear. And you have a president right now. So in Brazil, you have a federal independent election commission that's chaired by several Supreme Court justices. And they've ordered on several occasions that Bolsonaro insert fact checks into his advertisements that play on TV. Unlike American TV, some of these advertisements go on for 10, 15 minutes at a time. Mm-hmm. So they're often ordering, 30, 60-second fact checks. The election tribunal here ordered something like 25 insertions into Bolsonaro ads. And Bolsonaro is refusing to do these insertions.
So let's talk about, first of all, sounds like a good idea that he's not complying with it. I did see your article, Mike, about the paramilitary controlled favelas voting for Bolsonaro. And, not only does it go, as you explained, against the polling, but it also, you'd think poor people would vote for the leftists in this election. And I'm just trying to figure out how these people, is it because there's so much violence and the paramilitaries have kept the violence down that they're voting for a kind of fascist system, or are they being intimidated into voting for Bolsonaro by the paramilitaries? What do you think is going on?
I think it's partially, part of it is that they do go into some of these favelas and they take them over, and there's no longer big police raids. You have these massive police raids where, this summer you had a police raid where 18 innocent bystanders were killed. And these aren't, like the raids we have in the US where cops are showing up with, handguns. These are armored cars and, AR-15s. You'll go out to a restaurant and you'll casually see a cop carrying around his AR-15 here. And so, and what's wild is that when you watch Global, which has about an 80% market share here, Global will often broadcast these raids live. So there's a real deep sense of fear of any one of us could be killed at any moment in this city, right? There's a real deep sense of fear of that in a place like Rio. So much so that I started wearing a red hat from the landless workers movement, and my old host father told me, you should really be careful. You could get beat up over that. And I'm not one to live in fear. If somebody wants to try to take off my hat, they could try. But I think what's important to bring up is that there is a really deep fear here, and you have that fear in some people creates a desire for deep order, the kind of fascist order of
right.
Living with these folks. So some of these areas, they almost were complicit in inviting the militia in. But then if the person who owns your apartment building, who kills people in your neighborhood from time to time, who might be your employer, is telling you to vote for someone, you vote for them. You go to any of these polling stations, there's cops outside these polling stations. And you see all kind of signs here, your vote is secret. You see all kind of signs like that that are being put up as political posters. But a lot of folks, they don't trust anyone. This is a culture where people have been deeply traumatized by waves of violence, by years of dictatorship, through media manipulation, through all kind of methods. So there's a real deep fear here.
And another aspect, thanks for that explanation, Mike Elke, but another aspect of this story that you mentioned earlier and have mentioned in your reporting that I'm curious about, Bolsonaro has been encouraging his supporters not to cooperate with pollsters. That's a little, why would he do that? That would make his poll numbers look lower. Has he explained what reason did he give for this suggestion?
Well, as you know, when someone starts polling, people have a tendency to like the winner, right? So if you're trailing badly, it's easy to tell folks, oh, well, don't believe the polls because we're not cooperating with them. They're phoning, right?
I see.
Just this week, the Brazilian Congress, the lower house, is expected to take up a measure that would put criminal penalties on polling firms that get the results wrong.
Huh.
So There's been an all-out war, and Bolsonaro has claimed publicly that the low polling likely cost him 3 million votes. Bolsonaro is grasping for straws right now. He is looking for any excuse to claim that the media is against him, that the polling firms are against him, that the election tribunal that is chaired by the Supreme Court justice is against him. And he's desperate. He's going to do whatever he can to try to keep the message on how the election's being stolen. Now, what happens after the election results are known, we'll know Sunday. Unlike the U.S., we will know within several hours. There is an independent election commission that's chaired by several Supreme Court justices, as well as some other people, that's gotten very high international marks from all international observers. We will know sometime on Sunday, and then that begins a whole new period.
And it sounds like what Bolsonaro is doing is what we're now learning was the Trump strategy in 2020, which is to start discrediting a possible loss in advance as a justification for using violent or any other means, extra legal means, to overturn the election result. Is that what's going on here? Because that's what it sounds like.
Yeah, it's definitely what's going on here. I mean, they're using this to discredit the media, to discredit all these systems.
So there's a big fear here that if Lula wins, violence will erupt. And I should explain to listeners, by the way, that we're recording this on Thursday, October 27th, so people should take that in mind accordingly. So, as far as I can tell from your reporting and others, Lula is still leading in the polls by about 4 points or so. It seems uncomfortably close.
Yeah, it seems about anywhere from about 4 to 8 points. Not a landslide margin. As well as I do, it's Thursday, October 27th. The election's on Sunday, October 30th. A lot of things can happen in between then. The other thing we've seen is that Brazil is a country of 220 million people. It's actually larger than the continental United States in terms of size. The northeast of Brazil, where Lula is from, the poorest part of Brazil, the blackest part of Brazil, has voted overwhelmingly for Lula. We're talking 70 to 30%, right? It's a hardcore Lula area. You've had some states there that voted 90% for Lula, right? And the southern part of Brazil, which is settled by Italian and German immigrants, is going for Bolsonaro by about 20 points. And what's happened is that in the northeast of Brazil, you're seeing wait lines of 3 to 4 hours.
So that's a tactic we've seen in the U.S. and especially in heavily black neighborhoods, right, where some states just simply don't supply enough polling resources. So people are having to wait hours sometimes in the Lula areas to vote.
Yeah, sometimes people are having to wait hours. There's no vote by mail. There's no absentee ballots here. You have to go on the day of the election. It's obligatory here. You have to pay some small fine in your taxes, right? So we're seeing a lot of people skip, a much higher number than normal skip in an election that has a lot of attention on it. And there's a lot of concerns of vote rigging. Of rigging, but of playing with the polls here, of doing things.
Voter suppression, in other words.
Yes.
So what's the mood as we, wait for the results of this election? You were saying very tense. Is that true everywhere you go?
Yeah, it's very tense. There's a lot of people I know that are Brazilians. I mean, a lot of Brazilians have a deep cynicism of electoral politics. There's a lot of corruption and graft, particularly in the two administrations that preceded Lula. There was certainly some in the Lula administration. There was the first administration that really opened up the books. So there's a lot more that's known about that. And there's a real if you watch the local media, all the stories are violence and corruption and government and lies and scams and things like that. So there's a real feeling of it will never work. Brazil is doomed. And that's a real feeling that a lot of people on a lot of different sides have. Even people that are voting for Lula have told me that they think he's corrupt. Although a lot of people dispute that. A lot of people say that, this is the Brazilian system. People always get paid off. That's how things work. There's a lot of debate about this. And I think what's interesting about this right now is that you're dealing with a situation where you have a very dispirited population. But at the same time, people are very excited for Lula. Lula is a national hero. I mean, he did 2 years in jail. He led these big, huge strikes. He led the Workers' Party. He founded it. Today is Lula's 77th birthday. I'm going to a massive celebration for his birthday party in downtown Rio in a couple hours. We'll see how that goes. So there's a real feeling of despair, but also hope. If you go out to the beach or you go to the parties here, you will see people walking around with stickers, with Lula stickers, putting them on people. So if you go to any major party here, everybody has on a Lula sticker for the most part.
Let's talk. Yeah, let's talk a little bit, Mike Elk, about the forces in play here, trying to, back each side. In terms of supporting Bolsonaro, as you report, a very high number of complaints have been filed against employers who are intimidating workers to vote for Bolsonaro. As you point out, nearly four times as many complaints as there were in the 2018 election. And I'm going to quote you: several top labor leaders have also told Payday Report that numerous employers are threatening to fire employees if they don't support Bolsonaro, and rewarding employees who support him. So is it fair to say that, I'm sure the loggers and other logging companies and other interests that Bolsonaro has really helped at the expense of the environment, I'm sure they're all in for him, but is the corporate world in general in Brazil behind Bolsonaro?
Parts of the corporate world are behind Bolsonaro, but also the economy here really went in the tank under Bolsonaro. And also, it's like elites anywhere. I mean, these are, Bolsonaro's forces are evangelicals. They're, they're very culturally conservative. They're fake news peddlers. So you do have some part of the elite that are very heavily on the side of Lula. For example, I'm here in Zona Sul in Rio de Janeiro, which is the rich part, one of the rich parts of Rio, not the new rich, the old rich. The new rich parts of Rio are voting, that's Barra de Tijuca. They're voting heavily for Bolsonaro. But the old rich, the sort of bourgeois cosmopolitan types are all very behind Lula. Not screaming behind Lula, but part of what we've seen under Bolsonaro is you used to have all these center-left, center-right parties that really were wiped out in this congressional election in the last couple. And so now you're really sort of seeing left parties and right parties and not much in between. So you're seeing a shift in the political plates of Brazil right now.
So, I assume that on Lula's side, he has the trade unions behind them. Am I right to assume that organized labor is more powerful a force in Brazil than it is, for example, right now in the United States?
In some ways it is, but it has been taking a real beating. In the United States right now, it's been quite inspiring to talk to Brazilian trade unionists. Under Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro supported a rule, and then under him it was implemented. In Brazil, there used to be a tax that was leveled on every worker in Brazil, where you'd have to pay 1 day's salary to a trade union fund. That tax would then be distributed to different trade unions in that region. The trade unions come up with sectoral bargaining, so they set minimum standards for work classifications. Under Bolsonaro, that tax was taken away, which led some unions to lose as much as 40% of their membership. It was a real major issue. And so the unions here have really been taking a beating. and they've been quite enthused by what's been happening with American unions in the U.S. Right now, approval ratings of American unions, according to Gallup, is at 71%. That is the highest in the history of the Gallup poll. 50 years of polling on this question. In addition to that, we've also seen, according to the NLRB, a 58% increase in union elections this year. And Biden has certainly helped that by cheering them on. And, I think certainly we've seen some unions here in Brazil put out literature citing Biden's remarks as being pro-union. Certainly, I can say this, as someone who studied here under the Bush years, it's a lot cooler to be an American now with Biden against the coup than it was during the Bush years. So
you can actually, because of your reporting on labor here in the U.S., you can actually bring some hope there, which is really nice.
Well, I've been touring union halls here. Sorry, I'm quite tired. I've been working quite a bit. I've been touring union halls here, and people have been quite upbeat, quite enthused to hear about what's happening in the States. So that's a good thing.
That's great. It should make us feel good here at home, too, here in the U.S. So let's talk about a couple possible scenarios. Let's say Bolsonaro pulls off a win. Will he retaliate against Lula and his supporters?
There's a possibility that he will retaliate against Lula and his supporters. I don't think there's any question. I was out with someone the other night who was saying that they're really fearful if there'll ever be elections again if Bolsonaro wins. Mm-hmm. It's a scary, scary time here. And even if Lula does win, he's going to have a divided Congress. He's going to have a judiciary that in some parts is against him. It's not going to be easy for some time here.
And it sounds like if Lula wins, we could have a very likely scenario, Trump-like scenario, where Bolsonaro and his supporters deny that he really won, question the legitimacy of his government. Some of them may take to violence to oppose it. Is that a possibility in your mind?
Yeah, I think there's a huge possibility that there could be violence. I think there's going to at least be some. Whether it's widespread or not is the big question. And I think a lot of that will be determined by the margin. Obviously, if Lula wins by 8 or 9 points, it's tough for Bolsonaro to argue that he stole the election. Although there will be people that will believe that. Mm-hmm. If Lula wins by 2 or 3 points, I think the likelihood of that's going to be much higher. Already last night, Bolsonaro called a press conference with the military, arguing that the election's rigged. Who knows what could happen? Bolsonaro at one point claimed that only God could take him from the presidency. So, or by death. So we don't know. We're in uncharted territory. And it's a very, very scary time for most Brazilians that I'm talking to here in Rio.
Well, you've been doing great reporting from Brazil, Mike Elk, and sometimes it sounds like it's been a little risky too. So
I got robbed. In journalism, you're always used to saying "we" to talk about a publication.
Right. How'd you get robbed? Gunpoint or knife point or?
No, actually, I was in a party. Somebody just pickpocketed me.
Oh, all right. Well, that counts. So what I was going to say was, because of all of that, and because of the great work you're always doing at the Payday Report, which I really do encourage people to read. I read it all the time. Where can people go to read your stuff, and where can people go to maybe pitch in and help cover the expenses of all of this?
Go to paydayreport.com, and I should bring up that I pitched to a number of left magazines covering Brazil. None of them were interested. They're too interested in the U.S. elections. But we are in a global fight against fascism.
We are in a global fight to save the democracy and a global fight to save the planet. And with all the damage Bolsonaro is doing to the environment, it may pale besides the damage we're doing, but it is all one fight, isn't it?
It's a huge fight, and I think we have to. I think we have to do something.
Yeah. Well, good for you for getting down there.
Yeah, so folks who want to donate to help us cover the cost can go to paydayreport.com/donate. I appreciate your donation yesterday, as well as your producer's donation. This really helps us a lot. I mean, we have to buy data plans. We have to do all kind of stuff. And we might even have to extend our stay. So if folks could donate.
That would be interesting. Yeah. Yeah. All right, my friend. Well, again, Mike Elk of the Payday Report. That's paydayreport.com. Thanks for the great reporting. Thanks for getting down there. I know it wasn't easy. And first of all, keep us posted. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much.
We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.